A very important new partner for us as Moreau and Midwest Province Brothers Schools has been the partnership with the U.S. Province of Priests and Brothers. And the U.S. Province of Priests and Brothers just in the last year have expanded their administration and now include several lay people who are helping to move this mission and ministry forward. One of those lay people is Julianne Wallace, who is our next speaker. And what we see in our program is that it says the past 2 years provided our world with unprecedented challenges. These challenges seem to be continuing into the year 2022. Often keep us from recognizing God's call for us as both individuals and institutions. So in her keynote presentation, Dr. Wallace will explore how vocation can bring us back to the center, bring us back to who God is calling us to be, even in the midst of these great trials. And so without further ado, the Director of Apostolic Mission and Charism from the U.S. Province of Priests and Brothers, Dr. Julianne Wallace.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. It's wonderful to be here. I want to thank Dr. Fuentes and the Holy Cross Institute for inviting me to speak. And just as a disclaimer, what you're getting this morning is someone with a depth of wisdom and charism from Father Tom's call and Father Tom's talk. And I've been introduced to the Holy Cross charism just in 7 months. So you're getting both ends of the spectrum right now. Just to let you know, I spent the last 10 years in Franciscan higher education, and so much of what you will hear today is informed by my experience of that charism. But in many ways, there are parallels to the challenges in Franciscan education as there are in Holy Cross education. For instance, there are infinite number of ways to define what a Franciscan life looks like. This is mainly due to the fact that over 800 years, people have responded to the call of God through the lens of Francis in many unique and different ways. Although the Holy Cross charism is much younger than the Franciscan orders, I have found that if you ask a Holy Cross religious what it means to be Holy Cross, you will never get the same answer twice. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. Some people think, oh, I can't believe it's so hard to define the charism. I'll explain why I think, just in my short 7 months, why I think this is the case, why the charism is so flexible. The beauty of this flexible charism with the Franciscans or with the Holy Cross religious is that you can live out your call in many different ways. To be Holy Cross is uniquely your own. But it becomes difficult for people like us as educators and as leaders to then articulate what it is to be Holy Cross. And that is our question for our time together. Through this presentation, I will propose that institutional vocation can help us articulate where God is calling our institutions at this time and place. My hope is that we can use this understanding of vocation and discernment to inform what it means to be Holy Cross educators. So a little roadmap for where we're going. I always like to keep the audience well aware of where we're going on the road and that I will end eventually. First, we're just going to explore scriptural and historical understandings of vocation. This is going to be very familiar territory. In fact, we've already heard a little bit about it this morning. So this will be on the shorter side. Then I'm going to talk about institutional vocation. What is it? How do we discern it? And then finally, I'm going to conclude with just a couple of comments on what I see are some key facets of a Holy Cross institutional vocation. But to begin, I'd like to introduce you all to Reggie, or Blacklight is his stage name. Reggie was recently featured on the season finale of Queer Eye, which was filmed right here in Austin. Queer Eye is a popular Netflix series where 5 members of the LGBTQ+ community choose a hero, or really a participant, to make over for a week. It's a reality makeover show, if you're not familiar with it. The hero often gets a new haircut, they get a home renovation, they get a new wardrobe, and so much more. But this transformation is often deeper than just its superficial effects. I find myself crying at the end of every episode. It's ridiculous. The Fab Five, as they are affectionately known, often help the hero understand what is going on within themselves. Each member of the team wants to know from the hero who their true self is. And I'm borrowing this true self language from your favorite contemplative, Thomas Merton. This is why I enjoy the show so much. The physical makeover is great, but to watch the hero undergo a transformation, or rather a realization of self, is even more powerful. And this brings us to Reggie. Reggie is a successful rapper and music producer. Just before the pandemic, he, in the biggest show of his life, opened for Katy Perry, oh, forgive me, and Dua Lipa in India. His career was just about to take off. And then, dun, 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 what do you think happened? The pandemic. Oh. In the pandemic, as the world shut down, Reggie began to lose his sense of call. Reggie, like all of us, started to ask the question, why am I doing this in the midst of a world that is falling apart? When the Fab Five encounter Reggie, even though he was successful just 2 years ago, he doesn't know what he's called to do. They spend a week with Reggie and do all the typical things. He gets his haircut, they redo his home, they spend time with his teenage son, his wife, and his newborn baby. But mostly during the week, the Fab Five reawaken within Reggie a passion for his music and for his vocation. And if you look him up today, he's in Austin, he's doing shows all around Austin, he's releasing a new album pretty soon. I must be honest with you, there have been times during these last 2 years that I have felt like Reggie. And I am someone who's a big fan of discerning call continuously, waking up every morning and say, okay, yes, God, I'm gonna do this. But even myself have found myself going, why am I doing this when all of these other things are going on in the world? And Reggie and I are probably like most of you, because we found ourselves in a world turned upside down. We lost a sense of meaning and purpose that gives us the drive to thrive. But just because we are in moments of turmoil doesn't mean we abandon who God has called us to be. Watching this episode about Reggie was a reminder to me that in great times of stress, our call, our vocation is stressed too. And that's why we begin to question. Sometimes we just need to be reminded, either through prayer, community, or 5 members of the LGBTQ+ community, that this is you. This is your true self. This is who God has called you to be. I use Reggie as an introduction to vocation because he's a great example of all of us. Our world has changed and our rhythm of life has changed. Events such as the pandemic have a tendency to pull us away from who we really are. But what will keep us centered in the midst of adversity is our vocation. So first, a little bit about historical and contemporary understandings of vocation. And what I'd like to do is start with 2 examples from Scripture. Call in Scripture can be lived out in a couple of different ways. In the Old Testament, someone who responds to a call, in the Old Testament, what we see of vocation is someone who is responding to a call that involves a task on behalf of God. And I'd like to lift up Rebecca. Here we see Rebecca at the well offering Isaac's servant some water. When we first see her, Isaac is nowhere in the narrative. And Carol Myers, a scripture scholar, suggests that this means that it is Rebecca who has the agency. It is Rebecca as an independent woman in a patriarchal society. I mean, when I began to learn about this, it's just amazing that we see this little pericope of Rebecca at the well, holding the power and choosing on her own to leave her family and become a part of Isaac's family. At this point, Rebecca is controlling her own destiny. She then becomes the only matriarch in the Old Testament to receive a divine oracle from God. This message, this oracle, foreshadows the tensions that would exist between the 2 sons in her womb, and because of this oracle, Rebecca is instrumental in designating Jacob as the heir. In the Rebecca narrative, one could consider this oracle from God for her divine vocation, her calling. But given Rebecca's active role all throughout the narrative, it would seem that even before she received this divine message, Rebecca already had a sense of her own calling as someone who would participate in the matriarchal line of the Old Testament. I'd also like to lift up Mary Magdalene, a saint true to my heart. She's my patron saint. In the New Testament, responding to a call from God was much like the Old Testament, involving some kind of task, but it also involved a relationship with Christ. Mary Magdalene, after she had been exorcised of demons, travels with Jesus as part of a group of other women. Remaining with Jesus signals that Mary had a transformation of heart, not just of healing of the body. She stays with Jesus even until the moment of his death, but her call does not end at the cross, as she is the first to hear the news that Christ is risen in the garden. Christ calls to Mary Magdalene to share the good news, and she, in response to that call, rushes to proclaim the good news to all the apostles. It was because of her story that the early church was able to grow. In these first post-resurrection moments, Mary Magdalene was the early church. Here, I want to highlight that Mary Magdalene's call was dynamic. Her call changed over time. Who she was called to be when she was traveling with Jesus changed as soon as she met the risen Christ in the garden. I'd also like to lift up this movie from 2018 entitled Mary Magdalene. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It features Rooney Mara. It's on Netflix now. It's a great depiction of Mary Magdalene and her life of discipleship and companionship with Christ. It also is a great job of dispelling some of our wonderful myths about Mary Magdalene. It's on Netflix. If you need a little Holy Week practice, go watch that. It's one of my faves. Rebecca and Mary Magdalene provide us with two examples of vocation that are based in Scripture. Sometimes these calls were direct, like Rebecca's divine oracle, but most often our calls from God are more subtle. All of these calls involve some aspect of transformation. Rebecca left her family to become a matriarch, and Mary Magdalene became a companion of Jesus. These stories highlight an understanding of vocation that is dynamic and that is transformational. Just very quickly, and in stark contrast to this scriptural understanding of vocation, we'll look at a historical understanding of vocation where when I was growing up, I was taught if you had a vocation, you were going to be a priest or a religious sister, or you were going to be married, or you were going to be called to the single life. And let me tell you, that definition just never did it for me. I was like, what? I don't understand. Why can't I have something else? This is because a traditional Catholic understanding is based in a hierarchy of holiness. And Ed Hannenberg has done a lot of great work on this in his book called Awakening Vocation. And if you want to learn more about the development of the vocation of theology, I would suggest you pick that book up because I'm just giving you the cliff notes right here. So we have this very narrow understanding of definition from the church that has brought in some with Vatican II. Lumen Gentium brought in this understanding of the people of God and the priesthood of the faithful. But we still have a lot of people that understand vocation as our relationship status with God. Where's the dynamism in that? Where's the transformation in that? And then our Protestant brothers and sisters give us an understanding of vocation that is particularly tied to our job or our occupation, our station in life. And something that I want to point out here is our station in life in the view of the Protestant, a historical Protestant perspective, is stagnant and unchanging. If you're called to be a farmer, you're going to be a farmer your whole life. If you're called to be a doctor, you're going to be a doctor your whole life. Both the Catholic and Protestant understandings of vocation are different from what we see in Scripture. In the stories of Rebecca and Mary Magdalene, vocation is not reduced to the women's roles, such as matriarch or disciple. Instead, vocation is the story of how the women continue to respond to a call from God throughout their lives. Their discovery of self was not extrinsic to themselves as their job or religious status. Rather, their lives provide examples of women contemplating their own intrinsic identity, their own true self. These women provide us of an example of vocation, and they represent an understanding of vocation that is transformational and dynamic, which are two things that I think are missing from historical understandings of vocation. With this quick review of scripture and historical call, I'd like to introduce you to some more contemporary definitions, and I want to thank Marco for giving us a little preview. I'll give you a moment to read that quickly. This is the first, oh, excuse me, now AJ will come and make sure you can see. You're giving a preview. Everybody, AJ? You always have to be nice to your sound and tech people. You never know what could happen. This definition of vocation was the first time I heard it in college. It was the first time I ever realized that I too had a call and God was calling me to do something. So whenever I begin to talk about vocation with people, I begin with this definition because it involves two players in this, right? It involves yourself and assessing the true gifts and talents God has given you, but it also involves you going out into the world and seeing what the world needs of you so that you can use those things God has given you to respond to the world. The second definition, a little bit more thorough. This is from Ed Hannenberg's book. After he does that great historical review, he gives a whole chapter on what he would consider a contemporary theology of vocation, and he places vocation firmly in the foundation of God's grace. I'm just going to read you the last little bit. My vocation is me. It is my life lived out in concert with the gift of God's grace, God's loving presence within. Thus, to discover my vocation is to hear a certain harmony between who I am as a child of God and how I live in the world with and for others. A theology of vocation that is focused on the discovery of true self recovers the scriptural understandings of call as a life lived in response to God's invitation to us. This approach to vocation makes possible the ability for all people to recognize their true selves in God, so they might find their own deep gladness to contribute to the world. So now the real meat, the good stuff. Institutional vocation. Now I'm going to do something that is way out of my comfort zone. And we're going to start with a physics lesson. Only by the grace of God did I pass both of the physics classes I took. I am not a scientist. I am a musician at heart. Take a moment. So is anybody really good at physics here? If so, I apologize for these very basic definitions. So centrifugal and centripetal forces. A centrifugal force acts on a body moving in a circular path, and it is directed away from the center. That's really what I want you to take away from this. Centrifugal means away from the center. A centripetal force acts on a body moving in a circular path that is directed toward the center. So we've got forces acting outwards and forces acting inwards. And this great Google image of this person swinging a ball in an orbit, and you can see all the different physics things that happen. Oh, goodness. So I want you to think, and Father Tom named some of these earlier. Take 15 seconds. Think about some of the issues, some of the major issues you face in Catholic education today. What are the issues that are keeping you up at night? You got 15 seconds. Here are some issues that came to my mind. Keep in mind, I come from this higher ed world, but I'm thinking about everybody here. Controversies over mask mandates, controversies over vaccine mandates, gun violence in schools, fair teacher pay, balanced budgets, school enrollment, increased affiliation and disaffiliation within the church, These are just some of the issues that may keep you up at night. Anybody else have something different? Just yell it out. Racial injustice, thank you very much. One more, how about one more? Come on. Global climate change, gender identity, thanks. Crowd participation is a good thing. I need to know you're awake. This isn't a Zoom meeting. We are in person. So Cynthia Wells, she's a professor of higher education at Messiah College in Pennsylvania. She has this great article where she says that these types of forces in higher education, I'm broadening it to all education, all of these things that we have just named or that you thought of yourself act as centrifugal forces in education. They pull us apart from who we are. Much like Reggie, who in the centrifugal force of the pandemic began to question his own identity, our very institutions are being pulled away from our foundation because of the often urgent and very real pressures of our day. Wells theorizes that discernment of vocation can act as a centripetal force that brings education back to its center. Just like Reggie began to find his rhythm through his exploration of call, our institutions, through exploring and discerning their call, can counteract the centrifugal forces pulling them away. Institutional vocation becomes our centrifugal force. I'm not saying these issues won't go away, because you need those. My very basic understanding of physics is that you need both those centrifugal and centripetal forces to keep the orbit going. So these very real issues of our day are not going to go away overnight, as much as we would like to wish a pandemic away. But institutional vocation can help the ball keep going instead of spinning out of control with no center. Institutional vocation asks an organization to discern their call from God as a corporate entity. Much like personal vocation, this recognition of call leads to a response, and the response can be transformative, much like we saw in those scriptural pericopes. This transformation is not just for the organization, but can happen to the individuals that are part of our organization, which is key when we're in education, right? We're all about the transformation of students. Thinking more concretely, an organization that considers its institutional calling may ask, what is our purpose at this time and place? Do our mission and vision statements still align with that purpose? What or who is the Spirit calling us to be? Who is the Spirit calling us to serve? Are the answers to these questions different than they were 3 years ago, 10 years ago, 50 years ago? Institutions need to determine what kind of work God is calling the school to do, while at the same time considering what the world needs from the school. That's Frederick Buechner's definition right there. Just as individuals must encounter these very questions at some point in their lives in order to become whole and healthy, organizations too must undergo a similar process of analysis and integration. But what is our institutional vocation? And how is it different than some of the ways we talk about ourselves? You know, everybody has your mission, your vision, your identity, and your values. It's on your website. You probably talk about it on campus tours. This is not our vocation. Our institutional vocation can enhance those already existing identity, mission, and core values. But institutional vocation is not reduced to those things. Our identity are the stories we have told about our institutions up until now. These are the founding narratives of our institutions. These are the stories of famous graduates from our institutions or famous teachers. These are the things that you tell in the halls every day. Our institutional vocation are the stories that we are being called to tell. The stories we are being called to tell. And these stories, I think, are in two categories. The first, and I'll give you some examples of each in both categories. The first are the stories from our past that we are called to tell. An example of some of these untold stories would be the story of Georgetown University's involvement in the slave trade in the 1800s. At this time and place where racial reconciliation and reparation are critical in our national conversation, The student body at Georgetown began a process of advocating for reparations because of the institution's involvement in slave trade. And if you didn't know this, oh man, Jesuits are going to get on me after talking about this. If you didn't know this, Georgetown land was bought on the backs of 272 slaves. This was not a part of the regular lived identity of Georgetown up until just a few years ago. And the students called forth from the administration a recognition that this is part of who we are. They called them to lift up that story. So this is a great example of stories from our past that we don't like to tell, but we are being called to tell. Another great example of telling stories that have yet to be told are the reading of land acknowledgement statements that draw attention to the fact that this land that we make our home on, this land that we are meeting on today, was once taken from its original inhabitants. Displayed here is the land acknowledgement statement for St. Edward's. Traditionally, such statements are read at the beginning of public programs and events, but today I'd like to read it here. We pause respectfully to acknowledge that St. Edward's University sits on the land of the Coetecan, Tonkawa, Comanche, and Apache peoples. We remember their continued connection to this region and give thanks for them for allowing us to live, work, learn, and pray on their traditional homeland. We pay our respect to elders past and present. We recognize the grave harm and injustices brought by colonialism to all Indigenous peoples and to those of African identity who were stolen from their homes and enslaved on our campus. We grieve the vast loss of life, languages, and traditions. We deeply regret our own community's role in slavery, segregation, and upholding systematic racism. As a Holy Cross institution of education and transformation, we seek to learn, reconcile, and bring healing by addressing the wrongs of the past and acting now in the future to bring about a better time. Land acknowledgement statements, such as this one, call us to tell the story of a people who were here long before us, a people who honored this sacred land, a people who prepared this land, which was often violently taken away from them. Statements such as these do not right the wrongs of the past, but by telling the story of the original owners, the original inhabitants of this land, we acknowledge and make present their stories. They become a lived part of our institutional identity. I would also like to lift up another story, which Father Tom mentioned this morning. I was really excited to hear this. Back in the winter edition of the Notre Dame magazine, Notre Dame alumna and faculty member Kathy Cummings shares the stories of the early Marionite Sisters of Holy Cross, including the 4 who came to the United States in the early days to help Edward Sorin. What she does in this article is lift up the essential role of the Holy Cross Sisters in the building of Notre Dame, a narrative that has long been forgotten and rarely lifted up as an example of some of the key essential women that were early successors for Notre Dame. Stories like these from our history, stories of racial reconciliation, stories of land use, stories of women and minorities in our past, the story of the Rwandan genocide that Father Tom shared with us this morning, they are the stories we are being called to tell today. They call us to tell the whole story about who we are. A key part in the formation of our institutional vocation beckons us all to ask, what stories have gone untold in our history? A second type of story we are called to tell, so we got the stories from the past, and you could probably guess it, we have stories from our future. And to tell a story from the future, I'm going to go back into the past and back to my favorite good old faithful Mary Magdalene. We remember, as I said earlier, that she was the first to encounter Christ in the garden. And I want to make it clear, when she encountered Christ, he did not give her talking points to the resurrection. There was no brand planned. There was no marketing way, like we're going to get this message out there and this is how you're going to do it. No, he just said, go share the good news. And Mary Magdalene rushed off to the apostles who were walled up in a room, and she told them her new incredible story, a story that had never been told before. What new stories are our institutions being called to tell? Are they the stories of our first generation students or our undocumented students? Are they the stories of reinventing education for the next 100 years? Are they the stories of helping a very different and new generation shape our world? How are we as institutions called to tell these stories? I'd like to lift up one new story that one of our own from our Holy Cross tradition is beginning to tell. 2 weeks ago, right about this time, in fact, I had the pleasure of chatting with Sister Anne LaCour, the congregational leader for the Marionite Sisters of Holy Cross. In our time together, she shared with me the story of how the Marionite sisters have come to a recognition that their call from God as a congregation has come to fulfillment. Fulfillment, Sister Anne said, fulfillment is about being attuned to God working in our lives. For the sisters, this is not an end, but instead a time to celebrate the culmination of more than 175 years of ministry. She commented that this time of fulfillment has helped them recognize that with any call, there is a beginning and there is an end. But the congregation lives in the hope of the cross, lives in the hope of the Paschal mystery, that their legacy will indeed live on forever. In fact, she told me, she's studied this, that even after the last member of a congregation dies, the legacy will live on another 100 years. It is clear that the Marionite Sisters of Holy Cross aren't going anywhere anytime soon. I had dinner with them last night. They are ready to take it on, but their institutional vocation has changed. It entails finding new ways to pass on their stories, new ways to pass on their legacy to lay collaborators, such as the faculty, staff, and administration of the University of Holy Cross in New Orleans. Dr. Minnie Lee is back there. Woo woo. So while this is indeed a time of grief, this is also a time to look forward with hope. Father Tom said this morning, new life comes when we face the cross straight ahead. What moved me most about my conversation with Sister Anne is that she did not fear the next steps. What I heard in her voice is a realistic excitement for the way her congregation has courageously come to this decision and how they will together shape the next 40 years of the congregation. The Marionite sisters, much like Mary Magdalene, are providing us with an example of a new, brave, courageous story. And Sister Anne, wave your hand way back there in the back, I see you. She also told me at dinner last night that she would be happy to talk about this with any of you. The sisters are ready to talk about this, how they came to this discernment process. It did not happen overnight. It started in 2009, 1999. I gave you 10 more years. So she would be happy to talk with you more about this, because I know this is something that we are all facing, especially our religious congregations. Discerning your institution's vocation can help center your school in a great time of anxiety. In the midst of all of these centrifugal forces that you thought of earlier, we need something to bring us back, and that is our vocation, our call from God. Calling forth the stories from our past and calling forth the stories for our future can help us envision where the Spirit is calling us to be in the world. Now, I've given you some practical examples from each of these types of stories, but I'd like to end by saying a little bit about what a Holy Cross institutional vocation could be. Now, just remember, I have a Franciscan heart. It's slowly becoming Holy Cross, bit by bit, convocation by convocation. In the past year, I have been working with 8 Holy Cross priests from our provincial colleges and universities, which in the US province is Stonehill, University of Portland, King's College, and a tiny little school in South Bend, which need not be named. During our time together, we have been exploring what makes us Holy Cross educators. By reflecting on the stories of our past and by reflecting on the stories we might tell in our future, we hope to develop a pedagogy for Holy Cross higher education. This project is just beginning. In fact, if it were a marathon, and you will never find me running a marathon, we would be in the first 10 steps of the race. So what I share with you are 2 tiny seedlings for what we will hope will become a foundation for a pedagogical document on Holy Cross higher education. These are not new too. Father Tom said some of these earlier. First, as Holy Cross educators, we are ministers of accompaniment. We walk side by side with all people, including faculty, staff, and students, especially those made vulnerable by networks of privilege, prejudice, and power. We came about this through looking at our constitutions. We've already said a few of these this morning. As disciples, we stand side by side with all people. We don't stand in front of or behind, we stand side by side. And we are men and women with hope to bring in this world. And I can't take credit for this great observation, but in the meeting, in meeting with the Holy Cross working group, one of our priests from Portland said he encountered a faculty member who was given a presentation on what Holy Cross education meant to him, and he was Jesuit educated. And he said, you know, the Jesuit tradition is men and women for others, but the Holy Cross tradition is men and women with others. And that really has stuck with me, and that really became the seedling for understanding Holy Cross as a ministry of accompaniment. If we were just to discern our institutional calling through this lens, we might ask, how are we called today to be an accompaniment? Who are we being called to accompany? How can we use our gifts of Holy Cross education to reach out and be in relationship with? So, ministry of accompaniment. The second is a ministry of place or context. And this is not geographical place. It can be geographical, but as Father Tom reminded us this morning, it's more than just the geographical place we stand in. Holy Cross educators are missionaries. We make ourselves at home among more than one people and culture. Our ministry is local, particular to a place, a history, and a people. Wherever we work, we assist others not only to recognize and develop their own gifts, but also to discover the deepest longing in their lives, to discover their vocation. The charism of the Holy Cross. Oh, I got ahead of myself. I'm too excited, you guys. From the constitutions, we see this because we come not just as servants, but we come to be neighbors. We come to be with them. This is informed by that ministry of accompaniment I just talked about. And our mission sends us across every borders of every sort. And even Moreau gave us this seedling of an idea, and the fact that he responded to the needs of a particular place and time. He saw the needs of a place and he said, I'm going to respond to that. And as we began to grow, we saw the need of a place and we went there and we grew from there. And that is why I think, I told you this was coming. That is why I think the charism is so flexible. That is why it's so hard to pin down what it means to be Holy Cross. Because the charism adapts to the needs of the community at a particular place and time. Wherever we take the charism itself will be influenced by that place. Knowing the stories of place from our history, institutional vocation would beg us to discern what places are we being called to now? What does this particular place or community need of us now? And probably more challenging, Are we still needed here? And if not here, then where? The answers to these questions will help us discern our vocation as Holy Cross educators and administrators. You've hung in with me very well. We're at the end. It's going to be a wild end. I can't wait for you to see it. Vocation is a centripetal force that brings us back to who we are. In the midst of the many challenges and distractions from our day, continually discerning our call can help us center and counteract all the things that are pulling us apart from who we are. Throughout this time together, I have walked us through how both a personal and institutional understanding of vocation can do just this. Center us, remind us who we are, and prepare us for the task ahead. I told you it was going to be wild. To close, I'd like to bring one final example of joy that comes from the realization of vocation. Many of you may be familiar with the 2016 Disney hit Moana. The film tells the story of a girl, Moana, who is a strong-willed daughter of a chief, and they live in a Polynesian village. Moana is chosen by the ocean itself to reunite a mystical relic with the goddess Te Fiti. And you see here Te Fiti all angry and fiery, and that little small figure right in front is Moana, and she's holding this little green relic in her hand. My favorite part of the movie, this is a spoiler if you haven't seen it, I'm sorry, is the very end of the movie. It's a 90-second clip where Moana approaches Te Fiti, and she sings to her. And while Moana is singing to her, there's also a chorus singing in a Polynesian voice, which I've translated for you here. So what you are seeing, the italics are what is sung in Polynesian, and many of us don't really understand what it is unless you go to Google and say, what are they actually singing in that song at the end of Moana? And then in the non-italics, you see Moana's words. And Te Fiti is full of rage. She is on fire. She's huge. And the Polynesian chorus says, "Your eyes are so full of wonder, your heart an innocent roar. There is a task for you, my dearest one. There is a task for you." And Moana sings, "I have crossed the horizon to find you." I think of this as God speaking to me. "I have crossed the horizon to find you. I know your name. They have stolen the heart from inside you." Think about all those things that are stealing us from our purpose in higher ed. They have stolen the heart from inside of you, but this does not define you. This is not who you are. You know who you are. And then, you know what, I would show you the clip, and I'm really afraid Disney will come after me, because I read an article 2 months ago about Disney coming after some little peon, and I'm like, oh, that could be me. So go home and watch it. I cannot afford to pay a lawsuit, and I don't think the US province would appreciate that. But at the end of the clip, Moana places her forehead on Te Fiti's forehead, and she gets right up to that rage that is Te Fiti. And Te Fiti is transformed. She turns green and everything becomes luscious, and it's just like every Disney movie has ever ended. Happy, there are jokes, it's wonderful. So it is with us, with each of our organizations. We can be changed when we listen for the voice of God calling us to recognize our true selves. Maybe some of us have felt like Te Fiti in the past 2 years. When our institutional calls have been challenged, maybe we felt on fire and angry and hurt and desperate. We all need a Moana. We all need a Fab Five. We need a moment at the well, offering up our cup to someone else. We need a moment with Christ in the garden. These moments can help ignite a realization of our vocation. And when we broaden beyond these personal calls, we realize our very institutions are transformed by this recognition. Institutional vocation can help bring us back and call us into the future. Like the Marionite sisters of Holy Cross, our institutions too must bravely discern our own stories we are being called to tell. What will your Holy Cross story be? Thank you.